Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be continuing looking at David on the Run, Part 2, as we look at 1 Samuel chapters 23 and 24. Last week, as we looked, we saw David's kind of initial flight. We saw him hide his family away in foreign nations, in Moab specifically. He spent a little bit of time in Philistia, and now we're going to see him back in Israelite territory. And we're going to see Saul continue his, frankly, obsession, his paranoia, as he tries to hunt after David. And in fact, we're going to see an instance where David and Saul kind of stumble across one another. And I think as we look at this scene, it's going to be particularly poignant, particularly insightful for us as we think about how we are to interact in the face of difficult circumstances, how we are to treat our enemies, how we are to treat people that are persecuting us. So let's dive right in here to 1 Samuel chapter 23, starting with verse 1. Now they told David, we're not sure who they are in this case, probably just scouts or messengers or other people in Israel. They come to him and say, "Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors." Therefore David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" And the Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" And so at this point, David is hiding in the forest of Horesh, somewhere here in kind of northern Judah. And as they're there, this report comes to them that Keilah, this city in Judah, is under attack by the Philistines. And David inquires of the Lord. We're not sure if he's talking to Abiathar, the priest that is with him now, perhaps Gad. We heard him mentioned while he was in Moab, a prophet. We're not sure how he exactly inquires of the Lord here, but in some way, shape, or form, the Lord informs him, yes, you should go down to Keilah, and you should fight. You should fight the Philistines. I'll give you the victory. The city will be yours. And isn't it interesting that David's men are the one who say no? We talked about this a little bit last week, how Saul had with him the mighty men. And by contrast, David has with him everyone who's in distress, in debt, those who are bitter in soul. And these same men now say to him, "David, this is a bad idea. We're afraid here in Judah. We're afraid of Saul. How much more fear are we going to have for the Philistines?" And notice again where they're placing the power. They're saying, look, Saul's powerful and we're afraid of him. He's the king of Israel. But the Philistines, they're even higher on the spectrum of power. The Philistines are where the real power lies in our region. We need to not do this. Because if we have Saul and the Philistines against us, how can we possibly survive? Verse 4, though, David inquires of the Lord again. And the Lord answered him, "Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. And so David, despite his men's protests, he asks again of God, "God, should we go do this?" So in some ways, he does actually reassure these men who are struggling with their faith in this regard. He doesn't execute them. He doesn't criticize them. He goes back to God and says, "Hey, are you sure we should do this?" And I think this is really just this reassurance for the men, saying, look, God is saying again that we should do it. And God says, yes, go. And David and his men go, and they win this mighty victory at Keilah. And they get livestock, they get wealth, they strike the Philistines with a great blow, and David saves the inhabitants of Keilah. He saves this Judean city. Verse 6 then, when Abiathar the son of Ahimelech had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. This is just setting the stage. David is going to use this ephod in just a moment. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. It's interesting here. David will use the Lord's name. He'll use Yahweh, that name, as he's talking to the Lord here. But Saul uses kind of the generic word for God, Elohim. I don't know that there's necessarily something to be made of this, but it is really interesting. And in fact, actually, Israelites still today, people of Jewish backgrounds, will not say the name Yahweh. They think it's too holy to say, and so they'll say Adonai or Elohim instead. David, though, appears not frightened of that. David appears to be okay with that holy aspect of God's name, whereas Saul here uses a generic name for God. And Saul summoned all the people to go to war, to go down to Keilah, to besiege David and his men. Now David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." Then said David, "O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant." And this is here where we see David repeatedly using that name, Yahweh. O Lord, the God of Israel. In my Bible, and I suspect in yours if you're following along, Lord will be all in capital letters. L-O-R-D will all be capitalized. And that's how the authors of our Bible key us in to win that tetragrammaton, is what it's technically called. That name of the Lord, Yahweh, is being used. I also think it's interesting, though, we see this instance of him asking Abiathar to bring him the ephod. We're not entirely sure how he's using the ephod. It might be in some way how like the Urim and the Thummim would be used, where they would inquire of God and cast lots, and then those lots would reveal God's answer. Maybe he's doing something similar with the ephod. Maybe it's they throw the ephod up in the air, and depending on which way it lands, that says either yes or no. What is interesting about the ephod is the ephod historically was made out of the same material as the tabernacle. And so then as David has this ephod in front of him, it's almost as if it's a mini tabernacle, right? That presence of God is there in his midst. And he's asking him a question. Saul is coming after me, I know that. Will the inhabitants of Keilah, he's in this walled city now, remember, will the inhabitants of Keilah turn me over? And then in verse 12, Verse 11, will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said he will come down. So the Lord responds, yes, Saul is coming after you. Verse 12, then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. How disheartening must this be for David? He's just saved this town from the Philistines, this Judean city. Really, and again, this is the same tribe, the tribe of Judah. And he asks God, God, will these people whom I have saved, will they surrender me into Saul's hand? And God responds, yes. I have to imagine that that's a disheartening moment, a moment where maybe there's frustration, where there's sorrow, where it feels like all of our work is not being rewarded. And maybe we have felt similar things. Maybe we have felt those times where we feel underappreciated, where we feel like people aren't caring for us the way they should. And notice how David responds. He doesn't respond in rage to the people of Keilah. He doesn't massacre them or hurt them or whine and pout. David just says, okay. And then verse 13, then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. And so David and his men, their group has swelled a little bit in number. When we last heard them numbered in 1 Samuel 22, he had 400 men with him. Now he's got 600. Maybe some men of Keilah go against the grain and go with him. We're not sure. But he's got 600 soldiers now, and instead of pitching a fit, instead of being woefully upset, instead of throwing a pity party like we see Saul doing in chapter 22, we see David gather his men and go. And just go wherever they can. It's not safe for them here in the city, even though they have saved it. And certainly we should speak negatively of that city. That city is clearly in the wrong here. But we should also continue to praise David for his faithfulness, his really patience in the midst of these trials. And when Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. And so David flees into the wilderness of Ziph. This is a photo looking out over that wilderness, over this desert of Ziph. And man, I just can't even imagine going through this, right? Saving this city, saving this town, knowing that you finally have a place to lay your head, finally have comfort and ease and walls of protection around you. And now David flees into this image, into this wilderness, this barrenness. Oh, it just would be a miserable setting, I think. Verse 15, David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horish. I feel like this does have to be one of those low moments, but now David gets a little bit of a boost. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horish and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horish, and Jonathan went home. And so David gets a visitor in this wilderness. It's an interesting scene to picture Jonathan wandering through this wilderness and eventually stumbling across his friend. Certainly, I think we can almost see this as a God thing, as God just continuing to provide David with assurances that, yes, you will be king. Yes, you are in the wilderness. Yes, life is down. Yes, maybe you feel out, but trust me, I have you in my hand. Here is your faithful friend, and here his words of encouragement. He really even just says, he almost practically abdicates the throne and says, nope, you are going to be on the throne. Even my father knows this. He's pursuing you, yes, but deep in his heart, he knows that he will not prevail. That God is with you, that God is for you, and you need not be afraid. This is actually the last time that David and Jonathan will meet, somewhere in this barren wilderness. And yet in the midst of that wilderness, perhaps we can picture almost a flower, a small oasis, right? Here as these two friends gather together for one last time. As Jonathan yet again strengthens David, and as they yet again make a covenant, continuing to reaffirm the care that they will have for each other all of their days. It's a beautiful image. Verse 19, though, then the Ziphites, so the people who are probably nomadic herders who are also in this region, went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horish, on the hill of Hachilah, which is south of Jeshimon? Now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand." So these inhabitants of Ziph give Saul pretty detailed directions, right? He's at these strongholds on this hill south of this place. They're pretty much turning over David to Saul here. And Saul said, "May you be blessed by the Lord." Here he actually does use the name of Yahweh, which is interesting. "For you have had compassion on me. Go, make yet more sure. Know and see the place where his foot is, and who has seen him there, for it is told me that he is very cunning. See, therefore, and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. Then I will go with you, and if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah." And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. I think this almost reflects Saul's paranoia even more, right? These inhabitants of Ziph come to Saul and they give him pretty detailed descriptions of where David is located. And Saul says basically down to the footprint, I want you to track him and tell me exactly where he is. All of his little haunts, all of his little caves, all of his little strongholds, I want to know exactly where. And then, only then will I come down and I will hunt him out. Isn't it interesting that he's making these Ziphites do the dirty work for him? And now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon and the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him. And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul, saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." So this is down in the wilderness of Maon. Maon is a little bit to the south of that desert of Ziph. As you can see, it's a little less barren, but still not exactly a place where you want to put down roots typically. And so what we can picture as David is fleeing around one of these rocks, you can almost picture him in one of these valleys, right? All of Israel would have seen this tell or these hills as a rock, is probably how they would have referred to it. And so David is fleeing around one of these tells, running around in the valley, and Saul is catching up to him. The words actually almost involve a pincer movement, and so it's perhaps Saul has sent people around both sides of the hill, and so David knows that he's really in trouble. He's in this valley, and Saul has men coming from both directions. And again, it's a God thing. God uses even the evil of the Philistines here to protect his servant David. And so Saul retreats. He has to go back and take care of Israel. So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore, that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi. So as we talk about this chapter then, David started out in Keilah, and then he was in the wilderness of Ziph. He was then down in Maon, which isn't on the map, but probably a little to the south of Ziph. And now he heads up to En-gedi. And En-gedi, in fact, is the most beautiful of his stops in this place. En-gedi is right on the edge of the Dead Sea here. It's a coastal kind of area. And it's also a oasis. You can see kind of the midst of that desert. That is probably the wilderness of Ziph that we're looking at here, up on top of those rocky crags, those mountainous areas. And there's this kind of oasis in the midst of it, this little river that flows down into the Dead Sea. And in fact, if you were to go back into these canyons, you might find something like this waterfall at En-gedi, this little beautiful spring. And so David here is in En-gedi in kind of this oasis, this kind of brief bit of respite while Saul is off fighting the Philistines. Certainly as we look at these images, this is where I would prefer to be. And this is where David finds himself. But even here, he's not safe. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself, literally to cover his feet. But this typically does refer to the practice of going to the bathroom. And so you can maybe picture a cave. Saul does not want to dishonor himself in front of his troops, and so he goes into a cave and he has business to take care of. But again, I think you almost have to see the hand of God in this. Of all the caves in En-gedi, and believe me, if you were to go back into these cavernous areas, you would just find them dotted with caves, with little hidey holes, with places for David to be hiding with his men. Out of all the caves, Saul picks this one. And now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. So David is deeper in the cavern, he's deeper in the cave, and he sneaks up on Saul while Saul is taking care of business, and quietly he cuts off a small corner of Saul's robe. Notice again, David's men are encouraging him, now is your chance to strike. Now is your chance to take the life of the one who pursues you, to take the life of your persecutor, to take the life of the one who has it out for you. Now God has given him into your hands. Reach out and do it. Strike him down. And David instead just cuts a piece of the robe off. In verse 5, afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. I just think this passage is so powerful. I'll say verse 7 too. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. What kind of an example is David setting for us? What kind of an example is David setting for his men in this context, right? David's men are all saying, kill him, strike him down, it's time. And David says, no. I cannot reach out my hand against the Lord's anointed. I cannot reach my hand out against him. I cannot take his life like this. This is not what the Lord would want. And so instead he persuades with his words rather than with threat of force his men that Saul should be left alive. Remember, these men too, they're going to be hiding in caves just like this one until Saul is taken care of. Their lives are on the line too. They're responding how I think most of us would respond, and David instead is giving them the faithful response, saying, no, we cannot do this. We cannot strike down Saul. We have to let him be. And to their credit, and again, just to demonstrate David's faithfulness, they let him go. Contrast that with how Saul has been acting. Saul, who has no proof of any conspiracy, who has no proof that David is out to get him, and yet continues to pursue him, continues to seek his life. I certainly think I know who we're supposed to be in this story. Who really David even foreshadows, right, as he looks forward to a greater son who also will be silent as his persecutors bring charges against him. Who, like a sheep before his shearers, is silent, will not open his mouth, but instead will willingly go to the cross, will willingly give himself to those who hate him, to those who want him dead. This is not an easy way of life. And yet, can you imagine the freedom that David has here? This freedom that's found only in the Lord and his strength, this freedom to say, yeah, I could pursue my own good, I could pursue my own desires, my own safety. But you know what? God's got it. That's a level of faithfulness that I would love to see reflected in my own life. A level of faithfulness that I think we should all be aspiring to as God's redeemed, holy people. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. So Saul leaves the cave, and David comes out too and says, my lord the king, wait, and he bows. And certainly in this moment, I think we're meant to picture, or at least the image that comes to my mind, is the image of a knight kneeling before his king, right, or his lord. And when this happens, there's this inherent aspect of vulnerability, of giving yourself up to the person with the sword, right? And that's what David is doing here. He's making himself vulnerable. And I can only imagine the wheels clicking in Saul's head here. He was in that cave with me. My life was forfeit, and he gave it to me. And now here he is bowing to me, giving himself to me. And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men who say, behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. And so David is going to repeatedly, and we'll see actually Saul get in on this too, he's going to be talking about hands here. And he's going to say how God has given you into my hand. Your life was in my hand. And now the only thing there is this corner of your robe. The only thing in my hand is your life. The life that you still possess, the corner of this robe to prove my faithfulness to you. Look, there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I've done nothing to hurt you. I have not sinned against you. Stop listening to advisors who are saying otherwise. I have your best interest in heart, Saul. I care for you. I love you. You're the Lord's anointed. I am going to continue to serve you faithfully. Look at my hands. There's nothing in them but my care for you. And he even takes an oath on it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. He basically says, look, if you continue to pursue me, may the Lord give me vengeance. This is similar to what Paul says in Romans chapter 12, right? Paul reminds us, don't seek out vengeance for yourself. The Lord is the avenger. The Lord will take care of everything the way it's meant to be taken care of. And that's hard. It's hard to live in that mindset, to say, I don't need to seek out my revenge. I don't need to give way to my anger, to my rage, to the hurt that people have caused me. I have to trust and know that God will take care of it. Because oftentimes it feels like in the world that that's not the way it works, that evil wins, that good continues to receive punishment and hurt, and that wickedness and evil reign supreme. But we know that on the last day, God will avenge, that he will reward, that he will provide us with his salvation, that he will judge all the wicked, all evil, and that our salvation will be found in Christ's hands. That's where we turn to his hands, to the nail marks in his hands, to his brokenness, to his now resurrected glory. That's where we trust for God's vengeance, for God's care. And David is saying that here as well. Verse 13, as the proverb of the ancients say, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. Wicked people might seek you, but I'm not wicked and I'm not seeking you. My hands have nothing to do with this. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. And obviously no one likes dead dogs or fleas, but in their culture even a dead dog has more of just the social pariah to it, right? Dogs are an unclean creature in Israel. You can't eat a dog. So even a dead dog can't provide you with meat or anything like that. Not that we regularly eat dogs here in America. But yeah, there's this sense of just worthlessness here. Dead dog, a flea. You're coming after someone who's worthless. Why are you wasting your time on me? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. David is saying all of this in the midst of his vulnerability, paying homage, bowed down, his neck, his head given to the king. King, if you want me dead, fine. But may the Lord be the judge between us. I have done you no wrong. As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? You almost can't believe it, right? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Saul feels that sting of guilt, that sting of sin, that knowledge that he has been in the wrong all this time. And he weeps. This is an appropriate response to sin in our lives, to those sins that weigh us down, to those sins that continue to haunt our footsteps. Saul's weeping is an appropriate response, one that maybe we should do more of. I think about confession and absolution on the weekend. We should really feel the sting of that confession. We should know our sinfulness, know that we have repeatedly gone against God. We have repeatedly hurt the people around us, and that should cause us that sorrow. And then what joy we should have as we know that Christ continues to forgive us. He continues to offer us that love and forgiveness found in his blood, in his life, his death, his resurrection. We really can only know the sweetness of the gospel when we really experience those pangs, that bitterness of sin. He said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. Certainly the words of Paul ring true here again in Romans chapter 12. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's what David is doing here. That's what we're called to do in our lives. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. Saul even acknowledges it. I was totally in your hands. I was totally at your mercy, and you have kept me alive. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. This is Matthew chapter 5, right? Jesus saying, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This is that higher love, that higher calling that the followers of Christ have been called to. that's part of our lives. David is living it out here. And Saul's saying, I can't even believe it. And now, behold, Saul says, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Saul says, look, right now you have my robe in your hands. You had me in your hands, but I know that God is going to place my kingdom in your hands. You will be king. Saul is repentant here, and rightfully so. But we also see that Saul's going to fall prey to that temptation again. And maybe you feel that same weight of oppression in your life. Maybe there's a sin that just keeps rearing its ugly head, a sin that you can't seem to escape. And my encouragement to you today is to continue to confess it. Maybe it's in personal confession and absolution. Let me tell you, there's nothing stronger than actually saying to someone, I am struggling with this. Can you forgive me in the name of Christ? Pastor Howard or myself would be happy to provide that for you, that personal confession and absolution. Maybe it's finding an accountability partner. And we don't see Saul doing this. Someone who's going to keep you on the straight and narrow, like David had with Jonathan, right? Someone who's going to continue to lift you up, continue to speak Christ's forgiveness, but also continue to help you to fight against that sin. The devil wants us isolated. He wants us to think that there's no hope. But the fact of the matter is, even when we continue to sin, we do have hope because that's what Christ provides for us. That's the hope that we have in Christ, in his forgiveness. So let's continue to utilize that, to feel that joy that only Christ's forgiveness can bring. Verse 21, Saul continues, swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So Saul goes home, he leaves, he lets David keep his life in response to this great gift. But David is cunning, and David is wise, and so he continues to stay in the wilderness, knowing that this might not be the end of the story. And as we're going to see in these next couple of chapters, David is going to continue to deal with Saul and Saul's jealousy, and frankly, just Saul's sin. And so, like David, I pray that as we continue to deal with a world that sins against us, it does. This is the reality. Christ has said this as well. John chapter 16 comes into mind. In this world we will have trouble. But we're to continue to take heart because Christ has overcome the world. Christ has overcome our sin. Christ has overcome even death itself. And we have no greater promises than that. The same promises I think that David relied on, even if he couldn't see them fully, clearly yet. May God bless you this day, and may you continue to take solace in God and his provision and care in your lives. Amen. Thanks again for being with us, and next week we'll be looking at, I think, 1 Samuel 25, 26, and we'll try to get to 27 and kind of finish up David's, well, at least some of David's on the run. All right, thanks. Have a nice day.